An infertile rancher takes in a widow and her sons, thinking it's only for a few nights. But on the windswept edge of the Colorado frontier, nothing stays simple. The bunkhouse fills with their laughter, and his heart starts to change. Then, a slick railroad agent rides in with papers to steal his land in, lest he has a family by law. With 30 days before they take everything, the widow faces a choice between security far away, or the man who's given her and her boys a home. But what secret promise could bind them together forever? And when the dust settles, will this rancher still be alone, or will he risk it all to keep the family he never thought he could have? Before we begin, share a piece of your world in the comments. Your city, your energy. It's a powerful thing, being part of something bigger than ourselves. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dirt road as Elias Grant's wagon rumbled toward his ranch, the wooden wheels crunching over scattered stones. Clara Boone sat beside him on the wagon seat. Her younger son Timothy nestled against her side, while 8-year-old Samuel perched between them, his eyes wide as he took in the changing landscape. The scent of spring sage drifted on the breeze, mingling with the leather of the harness and the earthy smell of the cured hides stacked in the wagon bed. Elias kept his attention on the reins, stealing occasional glances at his unexpected passengers. The widow's face showed signs of worry beneath her composed expression, but she held herself straight and dignified despite the day's troubles. "Ain't much further now," Elias said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Ranch is just beyond that next rise." He gestured with his chin toward the rolling hills ahead. Clara nodded, adjusting her shawl around Timothy's shoulders as the boy dozed against her. "We're much obliged, Mr. Grant. I know taking in strangers isn't something most folks would do. The good Lord expects us to help our neighbors when we can." Elias kept his voice even, though his heart beat faster at this sudden change to his solitary life. The empty bunkhouse had stood silent for 2 seasons now, ever since he'd sold off most of his cattle and let the hands go. Some nights, the quiet of the ranch pressed in like a physical weight. The wagon crested the rise, revealing the Grant homestead spread out below them in the golden evening light. The main house stood solid and weather-worn, its cedar siding silvered. With age behind it, the barn's dark bulk cast long shadows across the dusty yard. And there, set apart from the other buildings, stood the bunkhouse with its small covered porch. Samuel straightened, pointing. "Is that where we're staying, sir?" "That's right, son." Elias guided the team down the gentle slope. "Built it myself, about 10 years back. Good solid roof, tight walls, and a proper stove for cooking and heating." The horses' hooves clattered across the wooden bridge spanning the creek that marked the edge of the yard. Clara's hands tightened in her lap as they drew closer to their new temporary home. Elias could read the mixture of relief and apprehension in her bearing a proud woman, forced by circumstance to accept charity from a stranger. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the bunkhouse steps. "Let me help you folks get settled." Climbing down, he reached up to lift Timothy from Clara's arms while she gathered her skirts to descend. The boy hardly stirred, exhausted from the day's upheaval. Samuel scrambled down on his own, his earlier nervousness forgotten as he explored the small porch. "Mama, look, there's a bench for sitting." Clara managed a small smile at her son's enthusiasm. "Mind your voice, Samuel. Your brother's sleeping." Elias shifted Timothy's weight carefully as he mounted the steps and pushed open the door. Dust motes danced in the shaft of evening light that fell across the plank floor. The room smelled of cedar and disuse, but it was clean and solid. 4 built-in bunks lined one wall, while a pot-bellied stove occupied the corner near a rough-hewn table and chairs. "It's not fancy," he said apologetically, laying Timothy on the nearest bunk. "But it's warm once you get a fire going. There's dry wood stacked round back, and the pump by the kitchen garden brings up sweet water." Clara stood in the doorway, taking in the spare but serviceable space. "It's more than generous, Mr. Grant. We'll manage just fine here." Elias nodded, suddenly awkward. "I'll fetch your things from the wagon." "Samuel, would you like to help?" The boy's eager assistance made quick work of unloading Clara's few possessions, 2 carpet bags of clothing, a box of kitchen implements, and a small trunk containing what looked like books and personal items. Each piece spoke of a life reduced to bare essentials but carried with dignity. As the sun settled toward the horizon, Elias showed them the location of necessary items: the woodpile, the pump, the path to the outhouse. He explained about the morning routine of the ranch, though these days it was just him seeing to the remaining cattle and horses. "I keep to myself mostly," he said, standing by the wagon once everything was settled. "But if you need anything, my door's open, and I usually take Sunday dinner after services, if you'd care to join me." Clara's eyes met his, warm with gratitude despite her reserved manner. "Thank you, Mr. Grant, for everything." He touched the brim of his hat and climbed back onto the wagon seat. As he drove the short distance to the barn, he could hear Samuel's excited voice drifting from the bunkhouse, questioning his mother about their new home. The sound carried clearly in the evening air, making the familiar yard feel somehow different, less empty, more alive. Later that night, after the horses were settled and his own simple supper eaten, Elias stood on his back porch. A lamp glowed softly in the bunkhouse window, and smoke curled from its chimney into the darkening sky. The sight stirred something in his chest, an ache he'd grown used to carrying, but which felt lighter somehow. He thought of his own quiet house, of the rooms that had stood empty since Sarah left, taking her dreams of children with her. The divorce had been civil, but final, her need for a family overcoming their years together. He'd understood, even as it broke something in him. Now, watching that humble lamplight, Elias felt the first stirring of something he hadn't expected. Hope, perhaps, or at least the sense that God's plans were larger than his own understanding. He didn't know what would come of this arrangement, but for the first time in a long while, his home felt less like an empty shell and more like the sanctuary. It was meant to be. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Elias Grant pulled on his boots. Through the kitchen window, movement caught his eye: 2 small figures silhouetted against the brightening horizon. Samuel and Thomas Boone stood at the corral fence, their faces turned toward the sunrise. The sight gave him pause, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He hadn't expected them to be early risers. Most town children slept late, unused to ranch schedules. But there they were, watching the day begin with quiet wonder. Thomas pointed at something, probably the horses moving in the misty morning light. While his older brother nodded seriously, Elias stepped out onto his back porch, boots creaking against the wooden planks. The morning air carried the sharp bite of spring frost mixed with the sweet scent of damp earth. As he crossed to the corral, the boys turned at his approach, suddenly shy. "Morning, Mr. Grant," Samuel said, straightening his shoulders like a man grown. "Morning, boys." Elias touched the brim of his hat. "You're up with the sun, I see." "Yes, sir." Thomas spoke softly, but his eyes were bright with excitement. "We saw your horses." "That you did." Elias began his morning check of the corral. "Here's Thunder," he said, gesturing to the big bay stallion that approached the fence. "And those 2 sorrels are Mason and Dixon, and Dixon." The boys listened intently as he named each horse, their earlier timidity forgotten in their fascination. The screen door of the bunkhouse creaked, and Clara emerged, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. "Boys, let Mr. Grant tend to his work," she called. "Come help me get breakfast started." Elias watched them scamper back to their mother, then finished his morning tasks. By the time he returned to his kitchen, the smell of coffee drew him inside, where Clara waited, a steaming cup in her hands. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to his coffee pot. "I wanted to thank you properly, and well." A morning cup seemed a good way to start. Much obliged. He accepted the offered cup, settling into his usual chair at the worn kitchen table. Clara sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "Mr. Grant, I want you to know we won't impose long. My brother in Kansas. Once I get word to him, he'll send for us." Elias nodded, though something in his chest tightened at her words. "No rush," he said quietly. The bunkhouse was standing. Empty anyway. The morning light streamed through the window, catching the copper highlights in Clara's hair as she ducked her head in acknowledgement. After sharing a companionable silence over their coffee, Elias hitched up the wagon for a supply. Run into town. The general store's bell jangled as he pushed through the door. "Mr. Peterson." The storekeeper looked up from his ledger with a knowing smirk that set Elias's teeth on edge. "Well, if it ain't the charitable bachelor," Peterson drawled as Elias began gathering supplies, flour, beans, lamp oil, and other necessities. "Reckon that empty house of yours ain't so empty now, eh?" Before Elias could respond, a familiar voice cut through the store's musty air. "Mr. Grant's generosity is Christian charity at its finest." Clara stood in the doorway, her spine straight as a rail. "Something this town could use more of, I'd say." Peterson had the grace to look abashed as Clara continued, her voice clear and steady. "A man who opens his home to those in need, expecting nothing in return. That's the mark of true character. We'd all do well to follow his example." The storekeeper mumbled something that might have been an apology and busied himself with Elias's order. Clara met Elias's eyes briefly before turning to examine a shelf of dry goods. But that moment of shared understanding stirred something deep in his chest, something he'd thought long buried. On his way out, Elias paused by the candy jar. "Add a measure of those boiled sweets," he told Peterson, thinking of two young boys who'd watched the sunrise with such wonder. The afternoon sun hung low. When he pulled the wagon into the yard, Samuel and Thomas helped unload the supplies, their eyes growing wide at the sight of the candy jar. Clara started to protest, but Elias shook his head. "Every boy needs a bit of sweetness now and then," he said softly. That evening, the smell of baking cornbread drifted from the bunkhouse, mixing with the crisp spring air. Clara had insisted on cooking supper as thanks for the supplies, and Elias found himself following the inviting aroma to her door. The inside of the bunkhouse had transformed in just one day. A checkered cloth covered the rough table and Clara's. Few possessions gave the space a lived-in feel. The boys set out tin plates while Clara pulled golden cornbread from the oven, its crust crackling perfectly. "Join us?" she asked, and Elias found himself nodding before he could think twice. The meal was simple: beans, cornbread, and the last of Clara's preserved peaches. But the conversation and laughter made it feel like a feast. Thomas told stories about the horses, while Samuel proudly recounted helping stack firewood. Clara's eyes sparkled in the lamplight as she listened to her sons, occasionally meeting Elias's gaze with a warm smile. After the meal, Elias stepped out onto the bunkhouse porch. The spring evening had turned cool, stars beginning to pepper. The darkening sky. Through the window behind him came the soft murmur of Clara's voice as she read to the boys before bedtime. It's punctuated by Thomas's questions and Samuel's thoughtful comments. The familiar sounds of his ranch at night: horses shuffling in the corral, the distant call of a whippoorwill. The creak of wooden boards cooling now mingled with these new voices. The combination settled something in his soul, making him wonder if perhaps the Lord had bigger plans than any of them knew. Maybe these temporary guests were meant to stay longer than a few weeks. Maybe ... But he didn't let himself finish that thought. For now, it was enough to stand in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of life returning to his quiet ranch. One day at a time, the spring sun climbed higher each day, warming the Colorado foothills. By Wednesday morning, Elias judged the ground had dried enough for fence mending. He found Samuel already up, watching the horses in the corral. "Care to learn something useful today?" Elias asked, gathering tools from the barn. Samuel's eyes lit up. "Yes, sir." They loaded wooden posts, wire, and tools into the wagon. As they pulled away, Elias glimpsed Thomas helping Clara sweep the bunkhouse porch, his small hands gripping a broom almost as tall as himself. The fence line needed attention where winter frost had heaved posts loose. Elias demonstrated how to test each post, showing Samuel the difference between solid and unstable ground. "See here," he wiggled a loose post. "Frost pushed this one up. We'll need to dig deeper, pack the soil tight around it." Samuel watched intently as Elias worked the post hole digger. The boy's face showed the same serious concentration his mother wore when tackling a task. When Elias offered him the tools, Samuel threw himself into the work despite his smaller size. "Never taught me about fences," Samuel said quietly, tamping down soil around a fresh-set post. He was sick a lot at the end. Elias paused, studying the boy's downturned face. "I'm sorry about your father's son." Samuel nodded, focusing on his work. They continued down the fence line, the morning passing in companionable labor punctuated by Elias's gentle instructions and Samuel's thoughtful questions. When they returned for dinner, Clara had laid out a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and dried apple pie. Thomas bounced in his seat, eager to tell them about helping with the sweeping. "Mama says I'm the best helper," he declared proudly. "That you are," Clara agreed, ruffling his hair. Her eyes met Elias's across the table. "Both my boys are good workers." As they ate, Clara spoke more of their life before coming west. "John, their father, caught fever last spring," she said softly. "The doctor's bills, the funeral costs. I sold what I could, but it wasn't enough." Elias noticed how she held herself straight, dignity in every line of her body despite the pain in her voice. "The boys never complained, even when we had to leave our home." She smiled at her sons. "We've managed, haven't we?" Samuel and Thomas nodded solemnly. Elias saw the quiet pride in Clara's eyes, pride in keeping her family together and teaching her sons to face hardship with courage. Sunday dawned clear and mild. They hitched up the wagon early, Clara and the boys in their best clothes. The whitewashed church at the edge of town already had wagons and horses clustered around it when they arrived. Inside, sunlight streamed through plain glass windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The boys sat quietly between Clara and Elias as Reverend Matthews delivered his sermon on faith in times of trial. Elias found himself aware of Clara's presence beside him, of the faint lavender scent from her freshly pressed dress. After the service, the congregation spilled into the meadow behind the church. Tables laden with food stretched under the trees: fried chicken, potato salad, fruit pies, and more sweets than Thomas had ever seen. Judging by his wide eyes, while Clara helped the boys fill their plates, Elias drifted toward a group of ranchers gathering near the oak tree. Their faces were grave as they discussed the latest news. "Railroad's pushing west again," Jake Miller said, shaking his head. "Surveyors been marking lines through Miller's Creek Valley. That's prime grazing land." Someone muttered. "They don't care about that," Will Porter replied. Denver and Rio Grande's got their eyes on a straight shot to the mines. A stranger in a dusty coat joined their circle, one of the traveling surveyors, by his equipment. "Might want to check your land holdings," he offered. "Homestead Act gives more protection to family parcels. Railroads less likely to push through if there's a household claim." Elias's gaze drifted to where Clara sat with the boys, helping Thomas cut his chicken into bite-sized pieces. The surveyor's words echoed in his mind, stirring uncomfortable thoughts. The afternoon passed pleasantly enough, but Elias couldn't shake his unease. He watched Clara chat with the other women, saw how naturally she fit into the community, despite being newcomers. The boys played tag with the other children, their laughter carrying across the meadow. That evening, after they returned home and the boys were tucked into their beds in the bunkhouse, Clara joined Elias on his porch. He poured them both coffee, steam rising in the cool night air. "I should tell you something," Clara said after a while. "I've written to my brother 3 times since we arrived. He hasn't answered." Elias studied his coffee cup. "Might be the letters haven't reached him yet. Maybe." Clara's voice was soft. "Or maybe he can't help us. Times are hard in Kansas, too." They sat in silence, drinking their coffee as stars appeared in the darkening sky. The cricket song seemed louder in the quiet, punctuated by the occasional distant coyote call. Coyote call. "We've imposed on your kindness too long already," Clara began, but Elias shook his head. "You're not imposing." He chose his words carefully. "The boys are good workers. Samuel has a real knack for ranch work. Even so, ... Clara traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "We can't stay forever." Elias thought of the railroad's plans, of the surveyor's words about family holdings. But he kept those thoughts to himself, not wanting to add to Clara's worries. Instead, they sat together in the growing darkness, each lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. A week passed like water flowing downstream, each day settling into a comfortable rhythm at the ranch. Elias rode into town early Tuesday morning, hoping to collect any mail before starting his supply run. The postmaster, old Mr. Jenkins, called him over with a concerned look. "Got something here you should see, Elias." Jenkins held up a familiar envelope, its edges worn from travel. "It's that letter Mrs. Boone sent to Kansas." Came back marked "Address Unknown." Elias's stomach tightened as he took the letter. Clara's neat handwriting crossed out with harsh black strokes made his heart ache. "You're certain?" "Checked it twice myself." Jenkins shook his head. "Hate delivering news like this." The ride home felt longer than usual, the returned letter heavy in Elias's pocket. He found Clara hanging wash behind the bunkhouse, her hands moving efficiently as she pinned sheets to the line. The morning sun caught her hair, turning loose strands to gold. Clara's voice came out gentler than intended. "Got some news?" "From town." She turned, reading his expression before he could speak. When he handed her the letter, her fingers trembled slightly, but her face remained composed. "I see." She tucked the letter into her apron pocket, her movements precise. "Well, that's that. Then?" "Clara, the wash needs finishing before it wrinkles." She turned back to the laundry basket, her shoulders straight and proud. Elias recognized the steel in her voice, the same tone she used when the boys were scared, when she needed to be strong for them. He watched her work for a moment, then left her to her privacy. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Elias rode out to check the north pasture, noting how the spring grass was coming in thick and green. Perfect grazing land, just like his father always said. As he crested the hill, something bright caught his eye. Red ribbons fluttered from wooden stakes driven into his land. Marking a straight line through the heart of the pasture, Elias dismounted, examining the nearest stake. The wood was fresh cut, the earth around it newly disturbed. His hands clenched into fists. In town, he found the surveyor's office a temporary setup in the back of the land office. The man from the church picnic sat at a desk covered in maps. "Those stakes in my north pasture," Elias said without preamble. "What's their purpose?" The surveyor looked up, recognition crossing his face. "Ah, Mr. Grant, please sit down." "I'll stand, as you wish." The surveyor shuffled through his papers. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad has filed intent to claim that section. Construction's set to begin within the month. That's my best grazing land. The company's prepared to offer fair compensation. It's not for sale. Elias's voice was quiet but firm. The surveyor sighed. Mr. Grant, I understand your position, but legally speaking, the railroad has certain rights of way. What about my rights? Well, the surveyor hesitated. A family holding would have stronger protection. Wife, dependent heirs. The law tends to favor established households in these cases. The implication hung in the air between them. Elias thought of Clara and the boys, of the returned letter in her pocket. I'll be consulting my lawyer, he said finally. The surveyor nodded. Of course. But remember that month's deadline. The ride home gave Elias time to think, but his thoughts kept circling like hawks over prey. The idea of marriage as a legal solution felt wrong somehow, too calculated, too cold. Yet when he thought of Clara's quiet strength, of the boys' growing attachment to the ranch, something warmer stirred in his chest. Clara had supper waiting when he returned a hearty beef stew that filled the kitchen with savory smells. Thomas and Samuel set the table without being asked, chattering about their day. And then Mr. Grant's horse let me pet his nose, Thomas announced proudly. That's because you approached him quiet and gentle, like I showed you, Samuel said with brotherly authority. If you want to learn to ride, you have to earn the horse's trust first. Clara ladled stew into bowls, her movements efficient. Walking comes before running, Thomas. You've got time to learn. Elias cleared his throat. Saw something interesting in the north pasture today. Oh. Clara passed him a bowl, her eyes questioning. Survey stakes. Railroads marking their claim. He tried to keep his voice casual, not wanting to worry the boys. Nothing we can't handle yet. Clara's spoon paused midway to her mouth. I see. She stirred her stew slowly, watching the vegetables swirl. And what does that mean for the ranch? Means? We've got some decisions to make, but not tonight. Elias turned to Samuel. Tell me more about what you learned with that horse today. The boys filled the meal with excited talk about riding lessons and ranch work. Clara remained quiet, though Elias caught her watching him with thoughtful eyes. After supper, Elias walked home alone. The spring night was clear. Stars scattered like diamond dust across the dark sky. He stopped halfway between the main house and bunkhouse. Looking up at the familiar constellations his father had taught him to navigate by. Marriage. The word felt strange in his mind. He'd tried it once before. Years ago, quiet failure that ended in quiet divorce when his inability to father children became clear. The shame of that still burned sometimes. But this would be different. This would be about protection, about preserving the ranch and providing for a family that needed shelter. If the law favored married men with dependents, well, that was just practical thinking. Except when Clara defended his honor in the store that day. Except when she baked bread that filled his kitchen with the scent of home. Except when her rare smile made his heart skip like a young colt. Elias stood under the stars for a long time, wrestling with the tangle of duty and desire in his chest. The night offered no answers, only the soft sound of wind through spring, grass, and the distant cry of a lone coyote. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in soft pinks and golds when Clara's knock echoed through Elias's quiet house. He opened the door to find her holding a cloth-wrapped loaf, steam still rising from its golden crust. Thought you might like some fresh bread for breakfast, she said, the morning light catching in her hair. The scent of fresh-baked bread filled his kitchen as Clara set the loaf on his worn table. She hesitated, then spoke again. I've been meaning to ask you something, Mr. Grant. Elias, he corrected gently. After weeks under the same roof, formality felt strange. Elias, she smoothed her apron. The boys, they watch you with the horses. Samuel especially. I was wondering if you might teach them to ride before summer comes. He thought of the survey stakes in the north pasture, of the railroad's deadline looming. But looking at Clara's hopeful expression, he found himself nodding. Reckon that's not a bad idea. Every ranch boy should know how to sit a horse. Over the next week, the corral became a classroom. Samuel took to riding like he was born to it, his back straight and hands steady on the reins. Thomas needed more coaxing, but his delighted giggles when the pony responded to his commands made even the old ranch hands smile. "Keep your heels down," Elias called, watching Samuel guide his mount in a careful circle. "That's it. You're getting the feel of it now." "Look, Mama," Thomas shouted from his perch on the gentle bay. "I'm doing it." Clara watched from the fence, pride shining in her eyes. Later that afternoon, Elias found her in his garden, turning soil with practiced hands. "Hope you don't mind," she said, wiping her brow. Seemed ashamed to let good earth go to waste. "Mind?" He looked at the neat rows she'd marked out. "What are you planning to grow?" "Beans here, squash along the fence." She pointed to each section. "Maybe some tomatoes if we can protect them from early frost." She'd said. The words settled warm in his chest. Words spread through town as spring deepened into early summer. Elias noticed the knowing looks, heard the whispers when he rode in for supplies. Most seemed approving a widow and her boys finding shelter, a solitary rancher opening his home. But the weight of expectations pressed on him. One afternoon, while Clara taught the boys their letters, Elias rode to the whitewashed church on the edge of town. Pastor Leary was tending the small garden behind the building. "Afternoon, Elias," the pastor said, brushing dirt from his hands. "Something on your mind?" Inside the cool church, Elias sat heavily in a pew. "Need some advice?" "Pastor, about marriage licenses and property filings." Pastor Leary's eyes were kind but serious. "It's about Clara Boone and her boys. The railroad's pushing to claim my north pasture. Law favors family holdings." Elias stared at his hands. "Seems like a sensible solution. Marriage is more than a legal contract, Elias. It's a sacred covenant before God." "I know that." Elias thought of Clara defending him in the store, of Thomas's trust when learning to ride, of Samuel's quiet determination to help with chores. Started that way practical thinking. But now, the pastor nodded slowly. "The practical benefits are real enough: land security, legal protection. But I see something else in your eyes when you speak of them. They've changed things. The house feels different, warmer somehow. Perhaps that's your answer then." Riding home, Elias pondered the pastor's words. The sun was setting when he reached the ranch, painting the buildings in soft gold. Through the bunkhouse window, he saw Clara bent over something in her lap, needle flashing in the lamplight. Inside, he found her mending his shirts, her stitches neat and even. The boys sprawled on the plank floor, charcoal sticks moving across paper as they drew pictures of horses and cowboys. "These were getting a bit threadbare," Clara said, holding up one of his work shirts. "Hope you don't mind?" "Much obliged," he said softly. Then, gathering his courage, "Would you and the boys like to take supper in the main house tonight?" Thomas's head shot up. Really? Elias smiled. "Plenty of room at my table." That evening, his kitchen came alive with sounds he'd almost forgotten: chairs scraping, plates clinking, children's laughter. Clara's fresh bread and beef stew filled the room with homey smells. Samuel helped serve while Thomas carefully carried water glasses without spilling. Watching them, Elias realized his vision of the future had shifted. No longer did he see just preserved grazing rights or protected property. He saw Samuel teaching Thomas to ride, Clara's garden flourishing year after year, shared meals and shared joys. He saw family. The room felt warmer than it had in years, and not just from the cookstove's heat. As Clara poured coffee and the boys cleared plates, Elias knew the pastor had been right. Whatever had started as practical necessity had grown into something deeper, something true. Late May brought warm breezes and wildflowers to the Colorado foothills. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern peaks when John Muller's wagon pulled into Elias's yard, kicking up dust. "Mornin', neighbor," John called out. "Figured you folks might want to join us for the barn raising today. Sarah's got plenty of food planned, and we could use extra hands." Elias glanced at Clara, who stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse. She nodded, already untying her apron. "We'd be honored," he replied. "Give us a spell to get ready." Within the hour, their wagon rolled along the mountain road, wooden wheels creaking against the rocky path. Samuel and Thomas perched on hay bales in the back, pointing excitedly at every new sight. "Look," Thomas gasped, tugging his brother's sleeve. "The mountains touch the clouds." Clara sat beside Elias on the wagon seat, her basket of fresh-baked pies nestled between them. The morning air carried the scent of pine and sage, while their horses' hooves kicked up dust that sparkled in the sunlight. "Never seen such big mountains," Samuel said, shading his eyes. "They're like giants standing guard." "That there's Pike's Peak," Elias explained, pointing west. "And that one with the crooked top is Mount Hermon. Been watching over this valley longer than any of us been alive." The Mueller homestead came into view just before noon. Already, wagons and horses dotted the yard, and the frame of the new barn rose like wooden bones against the sky. Men in work clothes swarmed over the structure, while women set up tables under the trees. As soon as they stopped, Clara headed for the outdoor kitchen area, pies in hand. The boy stuck close to Elias as he greeted the other ranchers. "Good to see you bringing the whole family," Tom Davidson said, clapping Elias on the shoulder. The word family made something warm bloom in Elias's chest. Soon he was up on the frame with the other men, muscles straining as they lifted heavy timbers into place. The work was hard but satisfying, each beam bringing the barn closer to completion. From his perch, he could see Clara working with the other women, her capable hands crimping pie crusts and stirring lemonade. The boys found their place too, running messages between work crews and fetching tools. Their eager faces shone with pride at being useful, especially when the men thanked them by name. By late afternoon, savory smells drew everyone to the long tables set up in the shade. Clara's pies sat among dishes of fried chicken, cornbread, and fresh churned butter. The women who'd sampled her baking praised her skill. "These apple pies are perfect," Sarah Mueller declared. "You'll have to share your crust recipe, Clara." Clara blushed at the compliments, but Elias saw how she stood straighter, more confident among these women who'd known each other for years. The first drops fell just as people were finishing their meals. Within minutes, fat raindrops pelted the gathering, sending everyone scrambling for cover under the half-built barn. But instead of dampening spirits, the sudden shower seemed to lift them. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon toe-tapping music filled the air. Children danced between the support posts while their elders clapped time. Thomas watched wide-eyed as couples twirled past and Samuel tapped his foot to the rhythm. The rain drummed on the partial roof, creating its own melody above their heads. Laughter and conversation mixed with the music, turning the unfinished barn into an impromptu dance hall. Clara stood near one of the open sides, watching the rain fall in silvery sheets, and Elias thought she'd never looked more at peace. As dusk approached, the rain eased to a gentle patter. Families began loading their wagons for home, calling out thanks and goodbyes. The Mullers' new barn stood proud against the darkening sky, a testament to community spirit. Elias helped Clara and the boys into their wagon, then climbed up himself. The horses picked their way carefully along the muddy road, their hooves making soft, splashing sounds. The boys huddled under a blanket in the back, tired but happy. They were about halfway home when Samuel's quiet voice broke the evening silence. Peleus's hands tightened on the reins. For a moment, he wasn't sure he'd heard right. "Ah," Samuel said again, more confident this time. "Will we help build more barns?" Before Elias could answer, Thomas chimed in. "Can we, Pa, please?" Elias had to swallow hard before he could speak, his throat tight with emotion. "Reckon we will," he managed, his voice rough. "That's what neighbors do." He felt Clara's gentle touch on his arm, saw the gleam of tears in her eyes that matched his own. The boys settled back, satisfied with his answer, while Elias guided the wagon through the gathering darkness. His heart so full it felt near to bursting. At home, Clara shooed the sleepy boys into the bunkhouse while Elias tended to the horses. His hands moved automatically through familiar tasks in hitching, feeding, checking water, but his mind kept returning to that single word, Pa. He'd thought that dream was lost to him years ago, along with his marriage and hopes of blood children. Yet here, God had brought him a family in an unexpected way, through a widow's need and 2 boys. Trust. The night air carried the lingering freshness of rain as Elias settled onto his porch. Stars peeked through breaks in the clouds, their light touching the wet grass with silver. From the bunkhouse came the soft murmur of Clara's voice, probably reading the boys their nightly Bible story, sitting there, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of his ranch at night. Elias felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. Perhaps this was God's plan all along, to give him the family he'd imagined. But something even better. A second chance at joy delivered through 2 boys' love and their mother's quiet strength. The next morning dawned gray and cool, with clouds hanging low over the distant peaks. Elias had just finished the morning chores when he heard hoofbeats approaching up the lane. 3 riders appeared through the morning, missed a well-dressed man in a dark suit flanked by 2 army soldiers, their blue uniforms stark against the muddy spring landscape. Elias straightened his back, wiping his hands on his work pants as they dismounted. Clara stood in the bunkhouse doorway, watching while the boys peered around her skirts. "Mr. Grant." The man in the suit stepped forward, his polished boots incongruous on the ranch yard's packed earth. "I'm Silas Hargrove, agent for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad." He pulled an official-looking envelope from his coat. "I have a notice for you regarding your property." Elias accepted the envelope, his weathered fingers contrasting with the crisp paper. As he read, his jaw tightened. The legal language was clear enough: 30 days to strengthen his claim, or the railroad would seize his best pasture land for their expansion. "Of course," Hargrove added, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "A family man would fare better in these situations. The Homestead Act provides certain protections for established households." His gaze flickered meaningfully toward Clara and the boys before returning to Elias. Single men often find their claims more vulnerable to progress. The implied threat lay heavy in the morning air. Elias's hand tightened on the paper, but he kept his voice steady. "Much obliged for the notice, Mr. Hargrove." The agent tipped his hat with a smug smile and mounted up. The soldiers wheeled their horses around, and the 3 riders disappeared down the lane, leaving only hoofprints in the damp earth. Elias stood still, reading the notice again as though the words might somehow change. Clara approached quietly, her face drawn with concern. "How bad is it?" she asked. He handed her the paper, watching as she read. 30 days, he said quietly. "They're taking the north pasture, unless—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the implied solution. Clara folded the notice carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "I see," she hesitated, then added, "I'll start. Breakfast? You must be hungry after the morning chores." "Morning chores." Elias nodded, but the thought of food sat heavy in his stomach. He watched her shepherd the boys back into the bunkhouse. Her shoulders straight despite the worry he could see in her bearing. That afternoon, while Elias mended tack in the barn, the postman's weekly visit brought more newsletter for Clara. She read it on the bunkhouse porch, her expression growing more troubled with each line. The letter remained unopened on her table through supper, through the boys' bedtime stories, through her evening prayers. Only when the boys were asleep did she unfold it again. Reading by lamplight, the paper bore the letterhead of Whitcomb's Mercantile in Denver. Mr. Whitcomb, an old acquaintance from before her marriage. Her a position as his housekeeper. The salary was generous, with promises of proper schooling for the boys and the security of city life. His elegant handwriting spoke of opportunities that a small ranch could never provide. Clara sat long into the night, the letter spread before her, remembering Mr. Whitcomb's courteous manners and fine house in Denver. It was everything she should want: safety, stability, education for her sons. Yet something held her back from mentioning it to Elias. Over the next few days, the letter's weight seemed to press down on them all. Elias grew quiet, retreating into himself. He still taught Samuel to ride and lifted Thomas onto fence posts to watch the cattle, but his smiles came less frequently. At meals, he spoke only of ranch work, his eyes avoiding Clara's. The boys noticed the change. They lingered between the main house and bunkhouse, their usual chatter subdued. Samuel spent long hours in the barn with Elias, while Thomas clung more tightly to Clara's skirts. "Why's Pa so sad?" Thomas whispered one evening as Clara tucked him into bed. "He's just worried about grown-up things," Clara answered, smoothing his hair. But her own heart ached at the distance growing between them all. 5 days after the railroad agent's visit, storm clouds rolled in from the mountains. The first fat drops began falling just as Elias finished the evening feeding. Clara stood in the bunkhouse doorway, watching the sky darken. "You'd best come to the main house," Elias called over the rising wind. "This looks to be a big one." They hurried through the rain, Clara carrying Thomas, Samuel running ahead with their Bible, and Clara's mending basket. Inside, the main house felt both familiar and strange, as though the weeks of meals shared there had been erased by recent silence. Clara set about helping prepare supper, the boys settling on the floor with their wooden horses. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley while rain drummed against the windows. The storm's wild energy seemed to match the tension in the room. Elias moved around his kitchen with careful precision, as though afraid to break the fragile peace. He'd grown convinced that Clara would take Whitcomb's offer, and who could blame her? A proper house in Denver would be far better than his humble ranch, especially with the railroad threatening their land. They ate to the accompaniment of wind and rain, the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Thomas pressed close to Clara's side at each thunderclap, while Samuel pushed his beans around his plate. Casting worried glances between the adults, the silence stretched thick as molasses, broken only by the clink of forks and the storm's fury. Each crack of thunder seemed to emphasize the weight of unspoken words, Clara's undisclosed letter, Elias's unvoiced fears, the boys' anxious questions. Finally, Samuel spoke up, his young voice clear despite the storm. "Are we leaving, Ma?" Question hung in the air like lightning, illuminating everything they'd left unsaid. Elias's hand tightened on his fork, his eyes fixed on his plate, while Clara drew a sharp breath. A week crept by like molasses in winter. The strain between Elias and Clara hung thick in the air, despite their careful politeness. Each good morning and thank you felt stiff as starched cotton, their usual warmth replaced by something closer to formality. Elias threw himself into ranch work, leaving before dawn and returning after dusk. He mended the north fence line with fierce determination, his hammer strikes echoing across the pasture. When he wasn't fixing fences, he drove the cattle toward higher grazing land, where the spring grass grew sweet and thick. The physical labor helped quiet his troubled thoughts. Though he couldn't quite silence them completely, Clara kept to herself, tending the garden rows alone. The beans were coming up strong, their green shoots reaching toward the sun, but she took less joy in them than before. Samuel and Thomas played nearby, their usual laughter muted. They built little corrals from twigs and pebbles, glancing often toward the distant figure of Elias on his horse. "Ma," Samuel asked one morning, "why don't we eat supper in the big house anymore?" Clara smoothed his hair, her heart heavy. "Sometimes grown-ups need a little space to think, that's all." One warm afternoon, Clara hitched up the wagon for a supply. Run into town. The boys stayed behind with Elias, who was showing them how to repair a broken harness. The familiar rhythm of the wagon wheels on the rutted road gave her time to think. Though her thoughts chased themselves in circles, the general store's bell jingled as she entered. While Mr. Peterson gathered her order, Clara browsed the seed display, thinking of summer vegetables. Behind her, two women spoke in loud whispers by the fabric counter. "Did you hear about that offer from Denver?" one asked. "Mr. Whitcomb's looking for a housekeeper, and he's got his eye on the widow Boone." "Well, she'd be foolish not to take it," the other replied. "That grand ranch won't last once the railroad comes through. Better to secure a proper position in the city, with schooling for those boys of hers." Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her back straight. She selected packets of cucumber and squash seeds, then moved to examine the bolts of fabric, a calico. Prints blurred before her eyes as the women continued their speculation. "She ought to take that Denver offer while she can," the first woman declared. "Before the rancher loses his land and she's left with nothing again." Clara turned, then meeting their startled gazes. "Ladies," she said quietly, "perhaps there are matters more worthy of your attention than my private affairs." She selected a bolt of blue cotton and another of sturdy brown, perfect for boys' trousers. The ride home seemed longer, the wagon heavier with unspoken words than supplies. The setting sun painted the mountains gold and purple, beautiful despite her troubled heart. As she approached the ranch, she saw lamplight already glowing in the barn windows. Clara found Elias there, methodically currying his bay mare. The rhythmic strokes of the brush against the horse's coat filled the comfortable warmth of the barn. He glanced up as she entered, but didn't stop his work. "I heard some interesting talk in town today," Clara said, settling on a hay bale. "Seems everyone has an opinion about what I ought to do." Elias's hand stilled for a moment. "Folks do love their gossip. He seems certain I should take Mr. Whitcomb's offer." Clara watched his face carefully. "Before you lose the ranch, too." The railroad, the curry brush resumed its steady motion. "Can't blame them for thinking practical," he said stiffly. "Denver's got more to offer than a struggling ranch." "I haven't made any decision," Clara said softly. Despite what the gossips might say, Elias nodded, his expression guarded. "You'll do what's best for your boys. That's all any mother can do." The distance between them felt wider than the barn's width. Clara stood, brushing hay from her skirts. "I should start supper. The boys will be hungry." That evening, after the boys were tucked into their beds in the bunkhouse, Clara sat alone by the kitchen stove. She'd brought her sewing basket over, determined to finish the new shirts she was making for her growing sons. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters and making the lamplight flicker. Her needle moved steadily through the fabric, each stitch a small act of permanence. The ranch's familiar night sounds drifted through the walls, the low of cattle, the whisper of wind in the cottonwoods, the distant yip of a coyote. All of it felt more like home than any fine house in Denver could. Yet the gap between her and Elias seemed to grow wider with each passing day, broad as the prairie stretching beyond their windows. Her hands stilled on the sewing as she gazed into the dying fire. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, counting out the moments of this uncertain time. A particularly strong gust shook the house, and Clara pulled her shawl tighter. She could see the dark bulk of the main house where Elias slept, its windows dark. So close, yet the distance felt impossible to bridge while both of them guarded their hearts so carefully. With a quiet sigh, she returned to her sewing, the needle flashing. In the lamplight, as the wind continued its lonely song outside. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the morning sun washing the foothills in gentle gold. Clara helped the boys into their best shirts, smoothing collars and tucking in loose ends while they fidgeted. The familiar routine of preparing for church brought a measure of comfort to her unsettled heart. The wagon ride to town was quiet, save for the creak of leather and wooden wheels. Elias handled the reins with practiced ease, his Sunday suit making him look somehow both more formal and more vulnerable. Samuel and Thomas sat between them on the bench, their small shoulders warm against Clara's side. The white-painted church stood proud against the blue Colorado sky, its simple cross reaching toward heaven. Other wagons and riders were already gathering their occupants, exchanging greetings in hushed voices. Clara noticed how some gazes lingered on their wagon, no doubt wondering about the uncertain status of their household. Inside, sunlight streamed through plain glass windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. The wooden pews were worn smooth from years of faithful attendance. Clara settled the boys between herself and Elias, helping them find the right page in the hymnal as the service began. Pastor Leary stood at his pulpit, his weathered face kind as he surveyed his congregation. His sermon that morning focused on trust and God's providence, words that seemed to reach directly into Clara's troubled thoughts. "The Lord's timing ain't always what we expect," the pastor said, his voice carrying to the rafters. "Sometimes His greatest blessings come wrapped in challenge and uncertainty. But just as the farmer must trust that seeds planted in spring will yield autumn's harvest, we must trust that our trials can bear fruit in His time." Clara felt each word press against her heart like a gentle hand. Beside her, Thomas leaned sleepily against her arm while Samuel followed along in his Bible, his finger carefully tracing each line. She was acutely aware of Elias's presence on the other end of the pew, his own attention fixed on the pastor's words. After the final hymn, while the congregation filed out to share news and refreshments, Clara hung back. She watched as Elias took the boys outside, then approached Pastor Leary near the altar. "Might I have a word, Pastor?" she asked softly. He smiled warmly. "Of course, Sister Clara. What's weighing on your mind?" Clara twisted her handkerchief between her fingers. "I've been thinking about vows, Pastor, about promises made in difficult times." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "How can one know if such vows would be truly blessed or merely born of necessity?" Pastor Leary considered her question thoughtfully. "The Lord often plants His finest seeds in the soil of hardship," he said. "Many a marriage that began in practical need has grown into the strongest kind of love. Perhaps what matters most is not the ground from which the vow springs, but the faithful tending of what grows from it." His words settled into her heart, like rain on dry earth. "Thank you, Pastor," she said quietly. Outside, the boys had already climbed onto the wagon, eager to share stories from their Sunday school lesson. Elias stood waiting by the horses, his expression distant. Clara took her place on the bench, smoothing her skirts as they began the journey home. "And then Teacher showed us about Noah's Ark," Thomas bubbled, his eyes bright. "She had wooden animals and everything." "That's wonderful, dear," Clara responded, though she noticed Elias remained silent, his thoughts seemingly far away. Wagon wheels turned steadily beneath them, carrying them back toward the ranch and all its uncertainties. The afternoon sun was high when they spotted movement near the creek. Stray calf had wandered from the herd. Without discussion, they fell into natural teamwork. Elias maneuvered the wagon closer, while Clara and the boys helped create a moving barrier with their bodies, guiding the calf toward the pen. "Easy now," Elias called softly, his voice gentle. As he approached the nervous animal, Clara circled wide, her skirts gathered up as she stepped carefully through the grass. For a brief, precious moment, it felt like old times, their movements synchronized, understanding flowing between them. Without words, the calf finally trotted into the pen, and Elias swung the gate closed with a satisfying clank. Their eyes met over the weathered wood, and Clara saw a flash of the warmth that had been missing these past days. But it faded quickly, like sun behind clouds, as reality settled back around them. That evening, Clara surprised everyone by serving supper in the main house. She'd spent the afternoon preparing a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread. It's a familiar work, helping to settle her thoughts. The boys seemed pleased by the change, chattering about their day as shadows lengthened outside. Candlelight flickered across the wooden table, softening the edges of their silence. The flames cast gentle shadows on the walls, making the distance between them seem both more and less than it was. Elias ate quietly, offering brief responses to the boys' stories, while Clara found herself watching him when he wasn't looking. After the dishes were done and the kitchen put to rights, Clara walked with the boys back to the bunkhouse. The evening air was cool and sweet with spring flowers, stars beginning to pepper the darkening sky. She helped them prepare for bed, listening to their prayers and tucking the quilts around their small forms, long after their breathing had settled into sleep's gentle rhythm. Clara stood watching them. Samuel's arm was flung over his head, his face peaceful in repose. Thomas had curled himself into a tight ball, clutching his favorite blanket. The sight of them, so vulnerable and trusting, made her heart ache in the quiet of the bunkhouse. Clara finally admitted the truth to herself. Leaving would do more than disrupt their lives. It would tear apart the world they'd begun to build here. These walls held more than shelter. They held the promise of home. The ranch, with its wide skies and familiar routines, had woven itself into their hearts. And Elias, for all his current distance, had become as essential to their happiness as the air they breathed. She reached down to smooth Thomas's hair back from his forehead, her touch gentle so as not to wake him. The decision settling in her heart felt less like surrender and more like recognition. Staying would be an act of love, not just necessity. Whether that love could bridge the gap between her and Elias remained to be seen. But she knew with sudden clarity that she had to try. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Clara stood in Elias's kitchen, her hands covered in flour. The familiar motions of kneading dough brought comfort as she worked, the rhythm matching her heartbeat. She had risen before first light, determined to make this day different from the tense ones that had come before. The kitchen slowly filled with the warm, homey scent of baking bread. Through the window, she could see Elias moving between the barn and the corral, his tall figure outlined against the brightening sky. He worked with his usual steady purpose, checking stock and mending what needed fixing. Clara brushed a strand of hair from her face with the back of her hand, leaving a dusting of flour on her cheek. The boys still slept in the bunkhouse, giving her these quiet moments to think clearly. She had spent much of the night considering her path forward, and the morning's task only confirmed what her heart already knew. When the bread was done, she set it carefully on Elias's kitchen table, steam rising from the golden brown crust. The scent seemed to fill every corner of the house, making it feel more like home than ever. She heard his boots on the porch and straightened her apron, gathering her courage. Elias stepped through the door, the morning air following him inside. He stopped short at the sight of her, his eyes moving from her face to the bread on the table. "Good morning," Clara said softly. She pulled out a chair, gesturing for him to sit. "Would you join me? There's something we need to discuss." He nodded, removing his hat and settling into the chair. Clara cut 2 thick slices of the fresh bread, setting them between them like a peace offering. Then she took a deep breath and met his eyes directly. "Would marriage protect the land?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "From the railroad, I mean." Elias's hands stilled on the table. He looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," he said. "It would strengthen the claim considerably." He paused, then added with careful deliberation, "But that ain't the only reason I'd want it." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I received Mr. Whitcomb's letter last week," she said, watching Elias's face tighten at the mention, "offering me and the boys a place in Denver. I reckon that would be safer than casting your lot with a rancher fighting the railroad," Elias said quietly, though she could see the cost of those words in his eyes. Clara reached across the table, letting her hand rest near his. "I wrote back yesterday," she said, declining his offer. The relief that flooded Elias's face was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. His hand moved to cover hers, rough and warm against her skin. "Clara," he breathed, her name carrying all the words he struggled to say. "We should talk about what this means," she said gently. "For all of us. The boys already love you like a father, but marriage would make it real in the eyes of the law." Elias nodded, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "Ain't had much practice at being a husband or father," he admitted, "but I swear I'd do right by you and those boys." "I know you would," Clara said softly. You already have. You already have." They spent the next hour talking more openly than they had in weeks. Clara shared her hopes for the boys' education, while Elias spoke of teaching them ranching skills and perhaps expanding the herd. They discussed practical matters too. How to combine their households, what improvements the bunkhouse might need as the boys grew. "The railroad's deadline gives us less than 3 weeks," Elias said, his face growing serious. "I know it ain't much time to prepare." Clara squeezed his hand. "We've been preparing since the day you offered us shelter," she said. "We just didn't know it then." The sun was well up when they heard the boys stirring. Samuel and Thomas burst into the kitchen moments later, skidding to a stop when they saw Clara and Elias sitting together, their hands still joined on the table. "Boys," Clara said, her eyes bright. "Mr. Grant Elias has asked me to marry him. Would you like that? Having him as your PA for true." Thomas launched himself at Elias immediately, while Samuel's face split into a wide grin. "Really?" the older boy asked. "You'll be our real PA." Elias caught Thomas against his chest, reaching out to pull Samuel close to you. "If you'll have me," he said gruffly. "Though I should warn you, being my sons means more chores." "Will we get more pie too?" Thomas asked hopefully, making them all laugh. "I reckon that could be arranged," Clara said, her heart full at the sight of her 3 men. Together the morning stretched into afternoon as they answered the boys' endless questions. Yes, they would all live in the main house. No, they didn't have to call Clara mother unless they wanted to. Yes, they could help decorate their new room. The boys' excitement filled the house with more warmth than any bread could provide. That evening, after Clara had taken the boys back to the bunkhouse to pack their few belongings, Elias sat at his desk with fresh paper and ink. The lamp cast a steady glow as he carefully wrote his letter to the county clerk, requesting a marriage license. His hand moved smoothly across the page, no trace of the tremor that had plagued him these past weeks of uncertainty. He detailed their intentions clearly, himself. Elias James Grant, wishing to marry the widow Clara Ann Boone, with the ceremony to take place before the month's end. The words felt right as he wrote them, solid as the foundation of his house, true as the love that had grown between them all. When he finished, He sanded the ink dry and folded the letter carefully. Tomorrow, he would ride into town to post it. But for now, he simply sat in the quiet kitchen, breathing in the lingering scent of fresh bread and new beginnings. News traveled fast in small towns. By Tuesday morning, every soul in Larkspur knew of Elias Grant's plans to marry the widow Boone. The general store buzzed with whispered conversations, and the telegraph operator found himself repeating the story to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Henderson from the millinery shop was the first to call on Clara, bringing a basket of fresh eggs and tart apple preserves. "Such wonderful news," she said, her smile reaching her eyes. "The boys must be thrilled." Clara accepted the gifts with grace, touched by the genuine warmth in the older woman's voice. "They are indeed," she replied, watching through the window as Samuel and Thomas helped Elias mend a wagon wheel in the yard. "We all are." Other visitors followed throughout the week. Some, like old Jim Tucker from the neighboring ranch, clapped Elias on the back with honest joy. "About time you had a proper family in this place," he said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Others came with honeyed words that barely masked their judgment. "My, what a practical arrangement," Mrs. Whitfield commented. Her thin lips pursed as she eyed the bunkhouse where Clara and the boys still slept. Clara simply smiled and offered her coffee, refusing to let such comments dim her happiness. Pastor Leary welcomed them warmly when they came to arrange the ceremony. "The church will be perfect for a small gathering," he assured them, his kind eyes twinkling. Sometimes the sweetest celebrations are the simplest ones. They chose a date, just 2 weeks away, early enough to meet the railroad's deadline, but allowing time for proper preparations. The boys could hardly contain their excitement when Elias announced they would ride into town with him to choose Clara's wedding ring. "Can we help pick it out?" Thomas bounced in his saddle as they rode down the dusty Main Street. "Something real pretty. Something simple and strong," Elias corrected gently, leading them to the jeweler's shop. "Like your ma." The boys pressed their noses against the glass case while Elias selected a plain gold band. Samuel nodded approvingly at the choice. "It looks like sunshine," he declared. Back at the ranch, Clara worked steadily on her wedding dress. She had bought the cream-colored fabric weeks earlier, intending to make curtains for the bunkhouse. Now her needle flew through the material, creating something far more meaningful. The simple design suited her, practical enough to wear again, but with tiny pearl buttons down the back that added a touch of beauty. The boys spent their free time gathering wildflowers from the meadow, practicing their bouquet-making skills. They brought armfuls of purple lupin and golden yarrow to the house, proud of their contributions to the wedding preparations. One afternoon, while Clara hung laundry in the warm spring air, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart sank as she recognized the railroad agent Silas Hargrove riding up with 2 companions. Elias emerged from the barn to meet them, his stance protective. "Heard you're planning a wedding," Hargrove said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. "How convenient." Elias stood his ground, calm but unmovable. Nothing convenient about it. Just right. Hargrove's face soured. "Paper vows won't save this land if the company decides to push harder," he warned, leaning forward in his saddle. "Marriage license or no, we have ways of getting what we want." Clara moved closer to stand beside Elias, her presence steady and sure. Elias met Hargrove's gaze without flinching. "This land is ours," he stated firmly. "It's been for 30 years, will be for 30 more. That's all there is to say about it." The agent's mouth twisted, but he seemed to realize further threats would be wasted. He wheeled his horse around, kicking up dust as he and his companions rode away. That evening, they gathered around the kitchen table for supper, the boys chattering excitedly about their flower-picking adventures. Clara served up plates of hot biscuits and beef stew, the routine of it feeling more like family with each passing day. "Reckon we could add another dozen head of cattle next spring," Elias said thoughtfully, breaking open a steaming biscuit. "Show the boys how to read the signs of good grazing land." Clara nodded, watching Thomas try to sneak extra butter onto his plate. "They'll need to learn their letters proper, too. Can't run a ranch without knowing your figures." "I already know my letters through K," Samuel announced proudly. "And Thomas can write his name." "That's a fine start," Elias said, his voice warm. With approval. "Your ma's right, though. Running a ranch takes all kinds of learning. Book learning and land learning both." Clara reached over to wipe a smudge of gravy from Thomas's chin. "We'll manage it all," she said softly. "Together." Later, after the boys were tucked into their beds in the bunkhouse one last time, they would move to the main house after the wedding. Clara and Elias sat on the porch steps. The evening air was sweet with spring, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. "Hargrove's threats don't worry you?" Clara asked, her shoulder brushing against his. Elias was quiet for a moment, considering. "They concern me," he admitted, finally, "but they don't shake my faith. This land, this family, we're making, it's right in God's eyes. That's what matters." Clara nodded, understanding. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The future held its share of challenges, but they would face them as they had chosen to face everything else, together with faith and determination. Lighting their way, the morning of June 15, 1878, dawned with perfect clarity. Sunlight streamed through the church's high windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews from the simple stained glass. The scent of fresh-cut wildflowers filled the air, their colors brightening every corner of the small sanctuary. Clara stood in the church's side room, smoothing her cream-colored dress with trembling hands. The fabric she'd originally bought for curtains now fell in neat folds, the tiny pearl buttons catching the morning light. She'd spent countless evening hours on the careful stitching, each one a meditation on the future she was choosing. "Ma, you look like an angel," Thomas whispered, his eyes wide as he fidgeted with his borrowed Sunday suit. Samuel nodded in agreement, unusually solemn in his own freshly pressed clothes. A soft knock at the door announced Mrs. Henderson, who had helped Clara pin up her hair. "It's time, dear," she said warmly. Everyone seated. Clara took a deep breath, smoothing her son's hair one last time. "Remember what Pastor Leary told you about being ring-bearers?" "Yes, ma'am," they chorused, each patting the pocket that held one simple gold band. The church doors opened, and Clara stepped into the aisle with her sons on either side. Samuel, tall for his age, stood proud as could be on her right. Thomas, smaller, but just as determined, held tight to her left hand. The congregation rose, their faces bright with welcome. But Clara saw only Elias. He stood at the altar beside Pastor Leary, his usually weathered face transformed by joy. His dark suit was freshly brushed, his collar starched, but it was his eyes that held her steady, sure, and filled with a warmth that made her heart skip. He watched her every step down the aisle, as if memorizing each moment. Pastor Leary's voice filled the sunlit church. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here today to witness God's unexpected blessings." He smiled at the small family before him. Sometimes the Lord plants seeds of hope in the soil of hardship, and from these seeds grow the strongest trees of faith. The boys stood perfectly still, though Thomas couldn't help bouncing slightly on his toes. When Pastor Leary called for the rings, they stepped forward with careful dignity, each presenting their treasure. "Elias Grant," Pastor Leary continued, "do you take Clara Boone to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise before God and these witnesses to love her, honor her, and keep her in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, as long as you both shall live?" Elias's voice was clear and strong. "I do." "Clara Boone, do you take Elias Grant to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Do you promise before God and these witnesses to love Him, honor Him, and keep Him in sickness and in health, forsaking all others as long as you both shall live? Clara's eyes met Elias's, seeing in them all the unspoken promises of home, of family, of faith in what they were building together. "I do." They exchanged rings, the simple bands gleaming in the morning light. Elias's hands were steady as he slipped the ring onto Clara's finger. Her own trembled slightly as she did the same, but his gentle squeeze steadied her. "By the authority vested in me," Pastor Leary proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He beamed. At Elias, "You may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, proper for church, but filled with promise. The boys clapped loudest of all as the congregation erupted in applause. Outside, the spring air was sweet with the scent of budding trees. Ladies from the church had set up tables laden with lemonade, coffee, and pies of every description. Clara's own apple pies held pride of place, their golden crusts still slightly warm from the morning's baking. "Congratulations, Mr. Grant," Jim Tucker called, pumping Elias's hand. "Mrs. Grant," he added with a courtly bow to Clara that made her laugh. Even Mrs. Whitfield seemed genuinely pleased, her earlier disapproval forgotten as she praised Clara's dress and the boys' perfect behavior during the ceremony. The children from town played tag around the churchyard while their parents shared refreshments and conversation. Thomas tugged at Elias's sleeve. "Can I have 2 pieces of pie?" he whispered. "Since it's special?" "1 piece now," Elias answered with a wink. "Maybe another after supper at home." Home. The word held new meaning now as the afternoon drew to a close. They bid farewell to their well-wishers and climbed into the wagon for the ride back to the ranch. The boys perched in the back, still in their good clothes, but now sporting traces of pie around their mouths. The setting sun painted the prairie gold as they approached the ranch. Elias helped Clara down from the wagon, then lifted each boy in turn. "Better see to the horses before dark," he said. "We'll help," Samuel announced, already heading for the barn. Thomas scampered after his brother, their Sunday shoes kicking. Up dust, Elias and Clara followed more slowly, watching the boys work together to remove harnesses and brush down the horses. The familiar routine felt different somehow, richer, more permanent. Later, after the boys were settled in the bunkhouse for one last night, they would move their things to the main house. Tomorrow, Elias stood in the doorway, the building that, too, had first sheltered Clara, and the boys would soon be converted back to its original purpose. Ready for hired hands when they expanded the herd, Clara joined him there. Her cream-colored dress now protected by a practical apron. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue of the sky. She slipped her hand into his, the new ring warm against his palm. "We're home," she whispered. Elias squeezed her hand gently, knowing she meant far more than just the buildings and land around them. Home was the family they'd chosen, the life they were building, the faith that had brought them to this moment. In the distance, a whippoorwill called, welcoming the evening. Inside the bunkhouse, Thomas laughed at something his brother said, and standing in the doorway, Elias and Clara began their life together beneath a sky filled with stars. The summer sun warmed the Colorado hills, bringing new life to the Grant ranch, with their marriage properly recorded at the county office. The railroad's claim to the pasture land crumbled like dry earth. Their lawyer, Mr. Peterson, confirmed what they'd hoped. Their case was ironclad now, protecting both the family and their land. Elias worked alongside Samuel and Thomas on the south fence line, teaching them to measure posts and string wire. The boys soaked up every lesson, eager to prove themselves worthy ranch hands. Clara's garden flourished under her careful tending. Rows of beans climbing tall stakes while squash sprawled between neat rows of corn. The shelf in her kitchen slowly filled with gleaming glass jars, each one sealed tight with summer's bounty. One warm afternoon, Elias returned from checking cattle to find the boys grinning by the front gate. There, proudly displayed, hung a wooden sign painted in wobbly letters, Grant Ranch. Their small hands had labored over every stroke, and Elias's heart swelled at the sight. That evening, they gathered around the kitchen table for a special supper of roast chicken and fresh vegetables. Laughter drifted through the open windows, mixing with the evening breeze. Later, Elias and Clara sat together on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. They spoke quietly of dreams taking shape, sending the boys to the new schoolhouse in fall, expanding their cattle herd, even taking in orphaned colts from neighboring ranches that needed help. For the first time in years, tomorrow felt full of promise. Stretching out before them like the endless prairie sky, the crisp autumn air painted the hills in shades of gold and amber. Inside the Grant Ranch, life settled into comfortable rhythms like well-worn leather shaped to fit. And Thomas worked alongside Elias, bringing in the last of the season's hay, their small forms hefting pitchforks with determined pride. Each evening, Clara filled the kitchen with the aroma of hearty stews and fresh-baked bread, preparing their bodies for the coming winter nights. One evening, after the dishes were cleared, the family gathered in the main house's sitting room. The fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Samuel sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully sounding out words from his new school primer. Thomas nestled against Elias's knee, fighting sleep but determined to hear his brother read. Clara's knitting needles clicked quietly as she worked, her face serene in the firelight. Elias looked around the room, taking in each precious detail. The warm glow on their faces, the sound of Samuel's careful reading, Thomas's drowsy sighs, and Clara's gentle presence filled spaces in his heart he had thought would stay forever empty. He was no longer the solitary rancher, marking time alone. Stepping out onto the porch before bed, Elias gazed across the moonlit pasture. The silver light touched everything with quiet beauty. He bowed his head and whispered his thanks to God, grateful that family could come not through blood, but through grace and the choice to love. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.